So welcome everyone. I'm just going to go over a few logistics before we get started here today. Type your questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom ribbon. That way we can keep track of them and make sure they get asked at the end. But feel free to add them at any time during the presentation. And then you can put your comments and discussion into chat. Again, make sure you put the questions into Q&A so we can keep them in all in one place. And that's really it I have for logistics. We are recording this meeting and we're looking forward to getting started. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim.
Great, thanks, Kelly. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Strategic Initiative Spotlight webinar series. This one specifically for the Endemic and Invasive Pests and Diseases Strategic Initiative. This morning we have Whitney, Brim, DeForest presenting on weedy rice. Whitney is a rice and wild rice advisor in Sutter Yuba counties, also covering the Capital Corridor and Placer, Nevada. And she's also the county director for Sutter Yuba. Whitney has a PhD and master's from UC Davis and double majored at Brown for her bachelor's in music and biology. So went all the way to Rhode Island to Brown. And one of the few people I know that majored in music. I think that's fantastic. So enough about that. I'll turn it over to Whitney.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Looks like it's a small group. So I don't know how we proceed here, but questions are welcome. Okay, so as Jim said, I'll be talking about weedy rice today. And so I'm going to cover our weedy rice issues in California. So what makes a weed, the case of weedy rice in California? So first of all, what is weedy rice? So weedy rice is one of those few weed species that we have that are actually the same exact species as our crop. So our cultivar, our varieties are Oryza sativa, and weedy rice is the same exact species, sometimes known as Oryza sativa spontanea or simply Oryza sativa species. It is considered one of the worst weeds of rice worldwide. It's found in every country that grows rice in the world. One of the things that makes it really tricky is that because it is the same species, it can hybridize with our cultivated rice. So once it's out there in the field, it will cross with our rice varieties. And the hybrids can be also weedy. Rice is normally a selfing crop. It has a very low outcrossing rate, about 1 to 2%. Whereas weedy rice actually outcrosses at a much higher rate, closer to 10% in some areas. So has all these characteristics that make it much closer to what we would consider a non-domesticated species, although it is the exact same species as our domesticated species. So it's a bit confusing, and it's a very tricky weed species to deal with as a result. The other tricky thing about weedy rice is that we have these different populations that are present all over the world in these different areas. They look different, so different phenotypes, different characteristics. Within California, we have different biotypes as well. So part of that is because it's the outcrossing rate. So we're continuously creating these new weedy rice types. So it's been a very difficult weed to deal with. It is a very difficult weed to deal with. So why do we even consider it a weed? You might be asking, right? So why is one plant considered a weed and the other one is considered a pest? They're the exact same species. They're both edible. They're not toxic in any way to any humans or animals. So again, why do we even care? So I'm going to take you back to rice domestication and crop domestication and what we consider a crop or a domesticated species versus a non-domesticated species. So back 10,000 years ago, when we started domesticating plants as a human world, one of the traits that we selected away from was seed shattering, right? So most plants, when they produce seed, they need their seeds to drop off the plant and disperse, right? So rice pre-domestication had this trait. It was the seeds shattered, right? But as we started gathering plants, for consumption, one of the things that we needed was those seeds to stay on the panicle or to stay on the seed head. So we've selected away from shattering in our domesticated species. Weedy rice has this characteristic, it still shatters. So at heading, the seeds will drop off of the panicle, and therefore it makes it very hard to harvest, right? We lose a lot of our yields. If we had weedy rice planted, we would have much, much lower yields. The other characteristic that is really important to agricultural crops, generally speaking, is seed dormancy, right? So we want our seeds, when they are planted in the soil, to immediately germinate, right? Or we're aiming for above 90%, right? That's what's considered good in most contexts. So weedy rice, for the most part, has retained its dormancy. So we might have some seeds that are viable in the soil and won't germinate given all the right conditions. For 10 years, there are some that won't germinate for 10 years, right? We'll go to till up the soil, and then suddenly there's a weedy rice when we thought we'd eradicated it. So those are really the two sort of physiological characteristics that we use to distinguish weedy rice versus our domesticated varieties. So again, seed shattering and seed dormancy. You might be kind of thinking, like, how do we go about characterizing those things in the field? It is kind of difficult, right? So the other thing that is quite characteristic of most weedy rice types is that they also thankfully have this red pericarp. So red pericarp or red bran. So over here on the right side of the screen is M206. That's one of our rice cultivars in California. You can see the seed color. Seeds don't look from the outward appearances much different in most cases from our cultivars. The weedy rice some of the types look very similar. But if you take off the outer seed hull, you can see the cultivar has light colored pericarp or bran, and our weedy rices, at least in California, all have red bran. And so this is one of the characteristics that we've been using to distinguish our weedy rice from our cultivars. Unfortunately, there are also some varieties that are also red brand. So this is not the only way to tell it apart. And there are weedy rices in other parts of the world that have white pericarp. So people call it red rice often, but really it could be weedy rice if it's red, but that doesn't mean it necessarily is if it's red brand. So really the two defining characteristics are the seed shattering and the seed dormancy. Again, why do we care? So there is a quality impact in our white rice. There's extra milling required to get that red bran layer off, and that can result in the seeds being broken. So you get lower quality when you go to take it to the mill. Consumers don't like broken rice very much. You don't get as much of a premium price for it. In fact, rice is sold in broken versus non-broken rice. So again, impacting the quality and potentially income for the growers. In brown rice, if you're wanting to process to brown, which would be the bran layer, that red pericarp or red bran rice has to be optically sorted out, which means that you need an optical sorter in your mill in order to be able to sort those seeds out. Like I said, it affects yields, it shatters. So obviously if your entire field was planted with weedy rice, you'd be losing a very large amount of your crop onto the ground. If it's very heavily infested, we know that yields can be reduced by as much as 70%. The weedy rice plants are very large and for the most part, very competitive. They're known to be able to extract nitrogen from the soil better than our cultivars. They're just very vigorous plants, weeds, right? And then, like I said before, management is really difficult. Same species as rice, so you can't use an herbicide. If you used an herbicide, you'd be killing your rice cultivars as well. In California, we don't have any herbicides registered for spot spraying, and therefore we have to rely on cultural management. And some of that involves pulling plants from the field by hand, which is not something we normally do in California. So in California, I'll just go through the background a little bit on how we got to where we are now. So we originally thought that weedy rice was not present in California, even just like 10, 15 years ago. The reason we thought this was that it was, we have a continuously flooded system, and it was thought that weedy rice was suppressed completely by floodwater, that it didn't come up through floodwater at all. We also have had a very strong seed certification program from the 1950s, and there were import restrictions, and our varieties are all bred here in California. So we were under the impression until about 20 years ago that we didn't have weedy rice at all here. When I started in 2016, the year that I started, there was I would consider a large rush suddenly to figure out what was going on. There were many reports of sort of off types or weedy types coming to the experiment station, coming through California Crop Improvement Association. And so we started hunting back through the literature to really see if there was any evidence of weedy rice being in California before the 1950s. And it turns out there was. So we found a report from 1917, which was from UC Berkeley. And there it is. So most injurious rice seed pests in California are watergrass, red rice, and rogue rices. So red rice would be the other term for weedy rice. So Luis and I, my colleague, Luis Espino and I started doing more research, found more evidence. There was a survey done in 1932, and where almost half of the seed samples from California contained red rice. Okay, so we have all this evidence that there was a lot of weedy rice in California back in the beginning of rice production in California. More surveys were done in 1930s to 1940s, 31% of seed samples showing red rice, 25 seeds per pound. In the 1950s, we did widely adopt certified seed. And then there's this sort of like blank spot here from the 1950s to 2000s, where there was little evidence of weedy rice in the literature. There was no anecdotal evidence from what we could find. So supposedly it just disappeared. And then in 2003, we had an infested field show up in Glenn County. And then from 2006 to 2008, we had a couple more infestations. And this was across Butte and Glenn counties. So we thought we got rid of it in 2006, 2008. Those fields were being monitored. Everybody thought it was gone. The growers were dealing with the weedy rice. So again, we're presenting ourselves to the outside world as though we have no weedy rice. So again, that survey from 2006, 2008, at this point in time, we had those few fields. We had what we considered one ecotype or one biotype. And then, like I mentioned before, 2009 to 2015, there started being some samples submitted to the rice experiment station. And then in 2015, the California Crop Improvement Association, which was our seed certification agency, started reporting that they were seeing these weedy looking rice plants in many fields. They gave a report at our grower meetings. And then in 2016, everything kind of just blew up. So in 2016 is the year that I started. And no, I did not bring weedy rice to California, but coincidentally, we'd never had a weed scientist working in the field really before at this point. And we found it everywhere. So we ended up with over 10,000 acres that year. We had 5 ecotypes or biotypes, and they were found in every rice growing county. By 2018, we were up over 14,000 acres and had 6 ecotypes or biotypes. So basically just seemed to be growing. So what happened? So how did we go from no weedy rice to 14,000 acres of weedy rice in California. So as I started working on this project in 2016, we started kind of trying to think about, what had gone wrong here, and also trying to answer this question for the industry. So at the beginning of my extension career, we really didn't have a definition for weedy rice. We were, going out in the field and sort of just saying like, oh, this looks weedy, or this looks like an off type, without any sort of standardized definition of what we were looking for. So we were finding what we thought were colored brand varieties, but we weren't checking for any of our weedy characteristics. So we weren't checking for shattering, we weren't checking for dormancy, etc. There was also an assumption made that all weedy rices would look the same. So that first biotype that we found in 2003, there was an assumption made that all the other weedy rices would look like that one. So anything that didn't look like that, we were not classifying as weedy rice. And there was some amount of talking about it with pest control advisors and growers, but it wasn't really a widespread extension, like concerted effort. There's no one really to blame for that. It just wasn't that big of a problem. It was only in those 2 counties. We weren't really talking about it. It was talked about a little bit, but it wasn't really a concerted effort. And then I'll show you on the next slide here. We also have a weed called watergrass, Echinocloa. It's in the Echinocloa family. And weedy rice looks a lot like watergrass. And so if you're looking at it from the edge of the field, you can't really distinguish the 2 plants from each other. You have to walk out into the field to be able to identify that it is weedy rice and not watergrass. And to complicate matters further, many of our growers have herbicide resistant watergrass. So we have really weedy fields at the end of the season. And it's really hard to spot. There was also a reluctance to report. People thought that we would be taking their fields out of production, that they wouldn't be able to harvest their fields. So there was really no trust at that point in time that something wouldn't happen to them. And then there was also a social stigma. So amongst the growers and PCAs, there was a stigma that, so-and-so has weedy rice. Oh my gosh, oh, that person has weedy rice. So nobody really wanted to talk about it. So it was very hush hush even for the folks that had it, even though there was no repercussions. Just to give you guys an idea here of how hard it is to spot. So this is a field at the end of the season. The rice varieties are growing. The rice is shorter. Our cultivated varieties are shorter than the weedy rice, but you can see the red arrow here points to a weedy rice plant, and these other plants are watergrass. And so from the edge of a field, this is right up next to the plants, and you can sort of see the difference if you're up close. But if you're looking at it from far away, you can't see that one of these is weedy rice and one of them is watergrass. So it's pretty much nearly impossible. So what did we do? So we really decided to focus on first identification. And then we also had some issues with sample collection. We had people taking samples out of the field. I'll give an example, driving from Sutter Yuba counties up to the rice experiment station with a rice plant in the back of the truck, right? So there's white rice seeds potentially flying out of the back of the truck. So we put in place a proper sample collection methodology, and both for us to be able to keep track and also to stop that seed movement. And best management practices were issued almost immediately. And then we started to work on dispelling some of the rumors. There was rumors about watergrass being able to hybridize with weedy rice, even though they're 2 different species, and it would not be possible. Building trust with us, with University of California Cooperative Extension Advisors, and that we wouldn't let everyone know basically that their fields were infested. So there's only 3 of us that knew where the fields were located. We have an internal map we don't share with the public. And so really trying to build trust so that we could get rid of this pest. So again, one of the hardest things was trying to figure out where it was. So there is weedy rice in this picture, but how in the heck do you figure out where it is, right? So one of the really biggest points was how do you identify it? How do you know when to give us a call? Okay, like I mentioned before, one of the biggest issues is distinguishing it between weedy rice and the watergrass species. So we came up with a pretty simple protocol. You have to identify the plants at panicle initiation. So when the panicle hasn't yet emerged from the plant, so before it's put out a head. And basically you take a look to distinguish from watergrass, you take a look at where the leaf meets the stem, and you pull it apart and take a look at what we call the ligule and the auricle. So all rice has a very distinct ligule and auricle, and watergrass does not. So unfortunately, you do have to go out in the field to look at this, but this was one of the big sort of messages that we started putting out. So we try to really simplify how to ID and when to call. So this is what we were telling folks. So once you've made all of your herbicide applications to control watergrass, and you still see something that looks like watergrass in the field, you need to go out and check. So you go out and check, see if those plants have a ligule and auricle. If they do, then you need to call us. If they don't, then it is a watergrass species. But we wanted to be really, really clear on that. Don't pull it out of the field. You need to call one of us out to the field so that we can assist. There's lots of things that look similar to weedy rice. I won't go into all the details, but we really wanted to drive home that, like, please do not remove it from the field. As soon as you're moving plants around, we have the potential for spread. So this was our sample collection protocol. Again, we tried to be as simplistic as possible. So if suspected, do not remove the plant from the field. Call a rice advisor. We will go to the field to take the samples, and then samples would be processed. So again, very, very simplified, trying to really drive this point home that, you know, exactly what we wanted people to do. We ended up with, like I said, 5 different biotypes that first year. We've since added a couple of others, but this also again made it a little bit more complicated for identification. So we decided that the best way to deal with this would be to put out as much messaging as we could on identification. Whoops, sorry. So we made posters, we made brochures. This was in collaboration with the California Rice Commission, but you can see these posters have, you know, definitions of what weedy rice is. If you go to any of the rice offices, rice related offices around the state, you'll see these posters up. It's got all the different types on it with some of the distinguishing characteristics for folks. Again, information about how to distinguish between weedy rice and watergrass. So very, very simple, very, you know, easy to see, easy to read, easy to digest information. We also put up a weedy rice specific website because this was such an issue for the industry. We really wanted to focus on this pest, and it houses all of our information about weedy rice on that one website so that people aren't having to hunt around for it trying to find it. At the same time as we were doing all these extension efforts, we were also doing some critical research efforts. So one of the most important ones was a genetic analysis. And the reason we did this was because we were having sort of finger pointing at the time about who brought weedy rice into California, and a lot of blaming each other for this problem. And we really wanted to understand, you know, where did it come from, if we could identify where it came from, and, you know, perhaps how it was coming in. It also for us highlighted that hybridization issue because it's still occurring. So we wanted folks to understand that if they're leaving weedy rice in the field, they're going to continuously create more and more of these weedy rice types. We did a phenotypic characteristic, and this was to help with identification. A lot of management practices, some cultural, you know, flooding versus non-flooding, some chemical for working on spot spray options, some yield impacts as well. We wanted to specifically say what the yield impacts were for our California varieties, and then some surveys to gain more understanding of what our growers were understanding, our PCAs were understanding about weedy rice. So I'll briefly go into the research part, but basically we had for the genetic analysis and the phenotypic analysis, we had 133 samples from across the state of California. We compared these to some of the southern weedy rices. We wanted to know if there was introductions coming from the south. We also had wild rice. So these are different species than our domesticated varieties. Most of these come from Asia. We had some specialty rice varieties, which were grown here in California. Some temperate japonicas, which are also California rice varieties, as well as some Japanese varieties. Some tropical japonicas from the southern US. We had indicas, aus. These are different subspecies of rice. So basically, we wanted to get as much of a sort of, range of rice varieties and weedy rice types as possible to kind of see if we could find any relationships. And I won't go into all of this, but the possible origins of California weedy rice, it ended up being that there were possibly very many origins. So we had some that were coming or very closely related to our southern weedy rices. We had some that were related to our varieties. We had some that were related to wild rices, some related to other species or other varieties from Asia. So basically many different ways that rice or that weedy rice was related to other rice varieties. With the phenotypic analysis, we wanted to give people an idea of, for the different types, if they had higher dormancy versus higher shattering, how long they might be dealing with some of these types compared to some of our lower dormancy types. So basically, again, trying to give identification characteristics, but also phenotypic characteristics that were related to management. We got some yield specific information on yield reductions, and this was really critical. So at the highest density, which was up to 40 plants per meter squared, which is quite a bit, we were getting a 71% reduction in yields. And this is the yield of our varieties, right? So this isn't including any weedy rice plants, but the yield of the variety. But even at fairly low densities of 8 plants per meter squared, we're already seeing almost, a half 50% reduction in yield. So it made a big impact being able to show people this. So where are we now? So our policy changes that were implemented soon after we started this research was that there was a change to the California seed law for rice, that all growers had to use certified seed starting in 2019. That meant that they could no longer save seed, they couldn't share seed. So a lot of the weedy rice was being transported around California through seed. So as of 2019, everyone has to use certified seed. We also had some varieties that were specialty varieties that were not patentable and therefore couldn't be included in the certified seed program. So California Crop Improvement Association implemented a new program called the Quality Assurance Program. And it was very similar to the certified seed program in that they were inspecting the fields, et cetera, et cetera. Last year we did a field survey, and I will say that we surveyed about 11,000 acres. And out of those 11,000 acres, about 2,200 acres are still infested. So we're not sure exactly if that's through all of it is, attributable to our impacts or our extension efforts, research efforts, but I would say that some of it likely is, especially to the certified seed program. So some lessons that we learned from this was proper weed identification is really vital for any sort of weed eradication program. You need a focused message coming from everybody. So university, industry, and growers all have to be on the same page. We really made it a big deal not to penalize anyone for reporting. Our extension efforts really should be very practical, very easy to understand, so anybody can understand them. And then our research efforts really need to incorporate our grower priorities and concerns. So that's basically it in a nutshell. I'm very close to the end. Some acknowledgements. This obviously took a lot of people and a lot of effort from a lot of folks to do all this work. And I don't know if I had time for questions, but
great.
Right to the end.
Thanks, Whitney.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now. I guess I have a question.
Sure.
I've never heard of red rice in the market. Can you actually purchase varieties that are red brand rice?
That are wild rice?
Red.
Oh, red rice. Oh, yes. Yeah. Actually, Lundberg's has a few red brand varieties, and there are quite a few from the southern US. Yeah, actually, the Lundberg's, I think, have at least 3 or 4 different red brand varieties.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned hybridizing with wild rice. I thought wild rice was a different genus. Am I
Oh,
missing?
well, so there's wild rice, like the wild rice that we call wild rice in the US, but then there are also wild rices like Onivara, Rhiza so some that are like a different species, but they can hybridize with Rhiza sativa.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Great. Matt Bauer says, why do these problems surface when an expert is in the field? Producers used to hate when we showed up to conduct tests because it always indicated they had a problem.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it was kind of funny that first year. A lot of people joked about the fact that it all showed up when I showed up. So, I mean, but I think it was definitely because, I was able to, actually identify it. Whereas before we didn't have a, clear weed science definition of what weedy rice was. And so I think that made it appear.
Yeah. When I was teaching plant pathology, I used to say that if you have a happy plant pathologist in your field, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And one of my brighter students said, if you have a plant pathologist in your field, you're in trouble.
Probably true.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But I will say it's been one of the most interesting weeds I worked on because it is the same species as rice. So from a weed science perspective, it definitely has been the most challenging thing I think I've worked on.
Yeah. I have another question. I know we're a couple of minutes over, but I'm gonna say it anyhow.
Okay.
So wild rice, does
Mhm.
Zizania?
Yeah, Zizania. Yeah.
Have we domesticated that to the point where it doesn't shatter, or is there some trick for harvest?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It is not a completely domesticated species. In fact, it has very high dormancy as well. So I wouldn't consider wild rice to be a wholly domesticated species, and it does shatter. Yeah.
Okay, so is there a trick to harvest so that you get as much as you can, even though it shatters?
From what I've heard from the growers, you just, go as early as you can. I mean, even with the weedy rice, you do get some of it. Not all of it goes, onto the ground. It like shatters at different rates.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks, Whitney. That was a really great presentation. Really interesting that there's a weed that's the same species as the cultivated crop and causing all kinds of issues. And thank you to everyone who participated today. Kelly, the recording will eventually end up on the Strategic Initiative webinar site.
Yep, probably by the end of the week.
Fantastic. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.